Our fellow teacher, Sarah Peyton, is back with us today to talk about overcoming childhood trauma with resonance. Sarah is an author, a certified trainer of nonviolent communication, and neuroscience educator who integrates brain science and the use of resonant language to heal trauma. Welcome back to AVAIYA, Sarah.
Oh, so happy to be here with you, Andy.
Yeah, always excited to have conversations with you, and I can't wait for this one. So let's talk childhood trauma. Obviously, a very sensitive topic, and we all know that trauma affects the brain. So why don't we dive in right there? What are the brain impacts of childhood trauma?
The brain impacts of childhood trauma are really extraordinary. In the beginning of my life, people would say things like, "Oh, your first 3 years form you. And then after that, it sort of doesn't matter what happens. You just have to work with those first 3 years." There was sort of a consensus that those first 3 years impacted, but there wasn't any sense either of brain growth and healing or of the other kinds of trauma and impacts that can happen to brains. And then this marvelous researcher, just in the last 10 years, came along, Martin Teicher, and he started looking at people's brains with fMRIs and tracking their brain differences based on the kinds of adverse childhood experiences they had lived through. What kinds of traumas had they lived through? Had they experienced verbal abuse? For everybody who had experienced verbal abuse, he saw the same brain change in the verbal cortex. For everybody who had witnessed domestic violence, he saw the same brain change in the visual cortex. We are impacted. Our brains are visibly impacted by the traumas that we live through. And the big 10 are the adverse childhood experiences, but there are pieces of research that show that all kinds of things can impact brains. Witnessing violence on television has a visible impact on brains. So we have these lovely and very tender organs that we're walking around with inside of our skull that are vulnerable, as we all know, to traumatic brain injury, concussions, football players, automobile accidents, but we're also vulnerable to the way people talk to us and to what we have to witness and see and to whether or not we're touched in ways that are not good for us. Did I answer your question at all?
You did. Yes. We talked about the brain impacts. That's interesting. Can you say the name of that researcher again?
Martin Teicher, Teicher.
Okay, right. Got it. Yeah, very interesting to see, right, how we can actually be witnessing, right, what's happening in the brain and what kind of impacts it's having. So let's talk about, right, what is the essence of why childhood trauma harms us so much?
Well, it harms us because it sets the stage for what we expect now, next, after this. So if we're harmed when we're little, we come out of our childhood expecting to be harmed, which both makes us like hypervigilant and impacts our nervous system and impacts our health and well-being. But it also orients us to choose friends and partners who aren't very kind to us. So one of the things I love about healing from childhood trauma is when people start to get bored with being treated badly. And they go, "Oh, that was boring." There's no more torture. There's no more, "I love this person. I want them to be with me. I want them to love me. I will stay with them forever." There's like, "Oh, they're not really in relationship here. I'm not existing for them. My needs are not mattering. I'm healing. I'm getting bored."
Yeah, interesting, right? The concept of boredom, right? Right. That's a good way of putting it. And I guess that would be like the hope for everyone, is that we'd all eventually get bored.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And say, "Oh, I would like real relationship. I want people to really listen to me. I want to have a sense that when I speak, it impacts you and you're changed and I'm changed by you. I want mutuality."
Yeah. And since we're talking relationships here, right? So since childhood trauma sets the stage for what we expect in life and our relationships, what are some of the ways that you see that play out for people, right, in different kinds of childhood trauma and how it impacts them later in life with relationships?
Well, if we experience verbal abuse when we're little, we stop even noticing it. I was listening to a morning talk show And the man was talking to his assistant, and he was saying, "How could you be so stupid?" And I was like, this is verbal abuse, but nobody's acknowledging it. And it's so familiar to both people that it's not even registering. And of course, we carry those voices inside ourselves. The way that we're spoken to, we start to speak to ourselves. So it all becomes this kind of sea of normalcy, that where we don't even realize that what's happening is harmful for us. It's harmful for children. It's harmful for people who are having to witness or hear. Like for people who are having to listen to the talk show, they wouldn't even know that they're being negatively impacted because it's so common in our world. I mean, when I'm doing healing work with adults, I'm often like, do you realize that this is verbal abuse? The way that you talk to yourself. Do you realize that this is verbal abuse? And most people are like, oh, wow, no. You know, I mean, this is just the way I talk to myself. This is the inside of my head. Sarah, you're an idiot. Sarah, you're stupid. Sarah, why did you do these things, you know? And so as we start to heal, this is another beautiful sign of the healing from childhood trauma, is that we start to notice and be able to be kind to ourselves, and to be kind to ourselves with our language, and to be kind to ourselves with our warmth and affection, and to be kind to ourselves with our choices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I like that, right? We can notice others outside of us, right, saying things that aren't loving, but also we can notice when we in our own heads are saying those not loving things, and recognizing that for ourselves. So let's talk about resonance, since that's the overarching theme today. So first off, what is resonance for people, and what can they do with resonance to heal childhood trauma?
Resonance is the wonderful but kind of rare experience of sitting with somebody else and speaking about or feeling something that we've lived through, and having the other person feel it with us and say, here's what I'm getting is, am I understanding you? And we get to say yes. That means that the other person is in resonance with us. This circuit of between two people of understanding, where both people are contributing and both people are communicating, and one person is understanding and the other person saying, yes, you understand me. And then, of course, it's lovely if it gets to reverse in session work. If you're a therapist, then it's going one way because that's what the setup is. But in a friendship, there would be a resonance for one person and resonance for the other person. And both people would say, yes, you understand me. And that's a state of resonance, which is somewhat rare, interestingly enough, when it is what brains need more than anything else. Brains need resonance for secure attachment. This is how parents create secure attachment with their children. They understand them and they say, yes, your emotions make sense. Yes, that's anger. And of course you would be angry. Yes, that's fear. Of course you would be scared. Yes, that's awe, tenderness, love, wonder. Of course you feel that. And those kinds of courses in a relationship with someone who's caring for us actually create the kind of networks in our brains that support long-term health and well-being, which are the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, where the prefrontal cortex says to the amygdala, basically, yes, you make sense. Of course you're having those emotions. And there's a calming, an extraordinary calming that comes for the entire human body when we have a sense that our emotions make sense. It's like, oh, we belong here.
Right. Yeah. And do you see that also in, as far as healing from childhood trauma, right? Having this resonance between others and ourselves, but also within ourselves, right? Like how does that work?
Yeah. So what happens with trauma, it turns out, is trauma is a sign that resonance hasn't happened. That's what intrusive memory is.